There are losses that break you loudly, with noise and argument and doors slamming and words said that cannot be unsaid. And then there are the quiet ones. The day Dorothy was forced out of her home, she had exactly $3 in her pocket. Not 300. Not 3,000. $3. 79 years old. A widow for 11 years. A woman who had lived in the same house on Carpenter Lane for 43 years, who had painted its kitchen walls herself 3 different times because she kept changing her mind and finally got it right on the 3rd try. Who had planted the garden by hand every spring with the particular faith of someone who believes in seasons they haven't seen yet. Who knew which stair creaked and which door stuck in humid weather and how the October light came through the west window and fell across the floor in a shape that looked almost exactly like a hand reaching across the room. She knew that house the way you know your own heartbeat. Not as a place. As a part of herself. And her nephew had taken it from her in a single morning. Quietly. Carefully. With paperwork signed decades ago at her brother's kitchen table. A shared family trust that Dorothy had never fully understood because her brother had asked her to sign it and she had trusted him. The way you trust people before life teaches you the specific and irreversible cost of doing that without reading the fine print first. Her brother had been a good man. His son was a different matter entirely. She stood on the pavement outside the house on Carpenter Lane with one bag packed in the 40 minutes she had been given. One bag for 79 years. She had stood in the bedroom trying to decide what mattered most and discovered, in the specific clarity of a terrible moment, that the things that mattered most were not things at all. They were the sound the back door made, and the way the garden smelled after rain, and the feeling of knowing exactly where you were when you woke in the dark. None of those fit in a bag. She took photographs. Her husband's watch. A cardigan her daughter had given her years ago. The small ceramic dish that had lived on the kitchen windowsill for so long she couldn't remember how it had arrived there. Her nephew stood in the hallway while she packed. He didn't offer to help. She didn't ask him to. She walked out the front door with her bag over one shoulder and her purse in her hand and the coat she had grabbed last because the morning was cold and she had not been thinking clearly because nobody thinks clearly when the worst thing is happening in real time. She did not look back. A conscious choice. She knew herself well enough to know that looking back at that doorway, at 43 years of her life visible in the hall behind him, would break something in her that $3 and an empty pavement were not equipped to repair. So she faced forward. The gray morning. The ordinary street continuing in both directions as though nothing significant had occurred. Because for everyone else on it, nothing had. She stood on that pavement for a long moment. And then something across the road caught her eye. A yard she had passed 100 times without once properly stopping to look at. Earl's Place. Everyone in town knew it vaguely, the way you know places that exist at the edge of your attention. And lined along the inside of the fence, old metal shipping containers. Weathered and mismatched and worn. One had a piece of cardboard propped against it. She was too far away to read it. She crossed the road anyway. Because when you are 79 years old with $3 and one bag, and the space where your home used to be still warm in your chest, you walk toward the thing that makes you look up. Even before you understand why. The cardboard sign said $3. Dorothy stood at the fence and read it twice. Not because she didn't understand it. She understood it immediately. The number was simple and the handwriting was clear and there was nothing ambiguous about a price written in marker on cardboard propped against a shipping container in a yard full of salvage. She read it twice because some things require a second look before you decide what to do with them. She looked at the container. It was large. Larger than she had expected from across the road. The standard 40-foot kind, dark green paint gone gray and rust spotted with age. The corrugated metal sides dented in several places in the casual way of something that has been moved around the world and bumped into things and kept going anyway. A pair of heavy doors at one end secured with a rusted latch. The whole thing sitting at a slight angle on the uneven ground, settled into the earth the way old heavy things do when they have been in one place long enough. It looked, Dorothy thought, exactly like something that had seen better days and was no longer particularly concerned about that fact. She felt an unexpected kinship with it. Earl appeared from behind the barn. 70s. Sun-weathered face deeply lined. The face of a man who has spent decades outdoors and carries every one of those decades visibly and without apology. He moved with the unhurried ease of someone who stopped being in a hurry at some point and found life considerably better for it. He looked at Dorothy. One bag, one purse, the specific composed expression of a woman who had very recently lost something significant and was not yet ready to discuss it, and he made his assessment quickly and quietly and kept it to himself. $3, Dorothy said, pointing at the container. Earl looked at it, then back at her. Has a hole in the roof, he said. I have $3, Dorothy said. Something moved across his face. Not pity. Not the uncomfortable generosity of someone performing kindness. Something more honest than either, the straightforward recognition of a situation that doesn't need commentary, offered by a man who had clearly learned somewhere along the way that the most respectful thing you can sometimes do for another person is simply accept what they are telling you about themselves. He took her $3. Dorothy Margaret Ellison had never been a woman who made decisions carelessly. 79 years old. Small and neat. 5'2" on a good day, slim in the way of someone whose appetite had always been modest and whose body had stayed accordingly. White hair kept short and clean, no vanity in it, cut practically because practical was what she had always been. Sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that she had worn the same style of for 30 years because they worked and she saw no reason to change what worked. Hands that were aged and slightly arthritic but still precise. The hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime doing things carefully and correctly and to completion. She had worked as a seamstress for 26 years. Had raised 2 children largely alone after her husband's health declined in his 50s. Had managed a household on a careful budget for decades with the specific competence of someone who understands that the difference between enough and not enough is almost always attention. She was not impulsive. But she was also, at 79 years old with $3 and one bag, completely out of alternatives. Her family found out by evening. Her nephew called twice. Her niece once. 2 neighbors appeared at the yard gate with the expressions people wear when they are witnessing something they find uncomfortable and would prefer resolved quickly so they can stop feeling uncomfortable about it. You cannot live in that, her nephew said through the gate. I am living in it, Dorothy said. It has a hole in the roof. I know, she said. I'm fixing it. She had no idea yet how. But she said it with the complete steadiness of a woman who has decided something and is entirely finished discussing it. That night she lay on a folded blanket on the metal floor with the hole in the roof directly above her. A rectangle of night sky, dark blue, clear, stars visible at the edges. Cold air coming through but not unbearably so. Not yet. She looked at the stars through the hole for a long time. Then she turned her head and saw something in the far corner of the container that she had not noticed when she moved in. Pushed back against the wall. Half hidden in shadow. Old and wooden and completely out of place. A box. It was a box. Old. Wooden. The proper kind. Not the flimsy cardboard that passes for packaging now, but real jointed timber, the corners fitted together with the care of someone who understood that things worth keeping deserve containers built to last. The wood darkened with age to a deep amber brown, the surface smooth from decades of handling. A simple iron latch on the front, rusted almost completely shut. Dorothy crossed the container floor carefully in the dark. Knelt down beside it, slowly, one hand on the metal wall for balance, her knees registering their opinion of cold metal floors with the blunt articulacy they had developed over the past several years. She worked the latch open with the edge of a coin from her purse. It took 4 minutes and more force than she expected. Then the lid came free. Inside, tools. Arranged with a care that stopped her completely. Not thrown in. Not accumulated randomly the way tools accumulate in drawers and garages and the bottoms of bags when they belong to someone who uses them occasionally and puts them back without thought. These had been placed, each one in a specific position. The hammer with its head toward the left, handle angled slightly. 2 screwdrivers nested beside it by size. A hand saw with its blade wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, the kind of wrapping that protects an edge for years, done by someone who understood that a well-kept tool is a form of respect for future work. A measuring tape. A box of mixed nails and screws sorted by size into separate compartments with the precise organization of a person for whom disorder was simply not an acceptable option. Dorothy sat back on her heels and looked at the box for a long time. Then she looked up at the hole in the roof. The rectangle of night sky had gone gray with early morning. Cold light coming through, flat and honest. Rain in it. She could smell the rain coming, the specific metallic smell that arrives 20 minutes before the first drop, and which Dorothy had been reading accurately since childhood. She looked back at the tools. Then she stood up, carefully, both hands now, knees protesting the whole way, and went to work. The roof was first. Everything else could wait, but the roof could not. Rain on an uninsulated metal floor would make the container uninhabitable within a day, and Dorothy had not purchased a $3 home to be driven out of it by weather in the first week. She found materials in Earl's yard. He had told her, briefly, in the way he said most things, that she was welcome to whatever she could use from the stacks along the barn wall. Corrugated metal sheeting in various sizes. A tube of roof sealant so old it had dried partially but had enough remaining to be useful. She selected what she needed with the careful eye of a woman who had spent decades making do with available material and had learned to see the potential in things before she saw their limitations. She worked for 2 full days on the roof. Up and down the wooden step stool she found behind Earl's shed. Measuring. Cutting. Fitting. Sealing. Her hands blistering on the first day and toughening on the second in the way hands do when you ask more of them than usual and they rise to meet the demand. On the second evening she climbed down the step stool for the last time and looked up. The rectangle of sky was gone. That night the rain came, hard and sustained, drumming on the metal roof with an enthusiasm that left no room for any other sound. Dorothy lay on her folded blanket and listened to it and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in a $3 shipping container on the edge of a salvage yard. Safe. Not comfortable. Not settled. Not anything close to the life she had lost 2 days ago on Carpenter Lane. But safe from the rain. Safe inside something that was, for the first time in 2 days, unambiguously hers. She closed her eyes. And then opened them again almost immediately. Because in the warmth of that small achievement she had forgotten something. Had walked past it twice that day without stopping. Something she had noticed on her second look at the toolbox that morning. Noticed and filed and meant to come back to. She reached for the lantern Earl had left outside her door that morning without explanation. Opened the toolbox again. Lifted the lid fully. Held the lantern close. On the underside of the lid. Easy to miss. Visible only at this angle, in this light, if you were specifically looking. A name. Written in careful deliberate ink that had faded but not disappeared. 2 words and a surname that meant nothing to Dorothy. And yet something about seeing it, a name written with such intention on the inside of a lid that had been closed for years in a container nobody had been using, made the rain on the roof sound, suddenly, very loud. She lay awake for a long time that night. The rain on the metal roof loud and constant and all-surrounding. The lantern burning low beside her. The toolbox open on the floor where she had left it, the lid propped back, the name on the inside still visible in the dim light. She had read it so many times by now that she could see it with her eyes closed. 2 words and a surname. Written with the deliberate care of someone who wanted to be found. Not immediately, not by just anyone, but eventually, by the right person, under the right circumstances. Dorothy did not yet know if she was the right person. But she knew one thing with complete certainty. She was going to find out who Margaret Elaine Voss was. She wrote the name in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, the one she had always used for shopping lists and appointment times and the careful practical notations of a long organized life, and she set it aside. Because she had more immediate problems than the identity of a woman whose name was written inside a toolbox lid. The cold was the most immediate problem. October had arrived fully and without apology. The container walls, metal, uninsulated, conducting the overnight temperatures with the efficient indifference of material that has no interest in your comfort, were cold to the touch by 4 in the morning and stayed that way through the early hours until whatever weak daylight reached them had worked slowly through the metal. By the time the interior was bearable, the morning was already half gone. Dorothy addressed this the way she addressed everything. Practically. Incrementally. One layer at a time. She had spent 26 years as a seamstress, had spent those years thinking about material. What it does. How it behaves. What it keeps in and what it lets through. She knew insulation the way a doctor knows anatomy, not theoretically but practically, from the inside out, from the specific experience of working with it daily until its properties became instinct. She applied that instinct now. Earl had old moving blankets stacked in his barn. Thick industrial ones, the kind used for furniture removal, heavy and dense. He gave her 14 without being asked, in the particular manner he had of producing useful things without making a performance of the generosity. She lined the walls methodically, floor to ceiling, overlapping at the edges, securing them with nails from the toolbox. The floor she covered in 2 layers, tucking the edges up against the walls to eliminate the gap where cold crept through. The difference was immediate. Not warm. Not yet. But the specific difference between a cold that defeats you and a cold that can be negotiated with. She established a routine. 6 in the morning, woke before any alarm, her body having always kept its own reliable time. Walked 2 blocks to the public bathroom at the park. Returned and made instant coffee on the small single-burner camp stove Earl had placed on her step one morning without explanation or ceremony. She ate carefully. Crackers. Tinned fish. Whatever fruit was available at the market 2 streets over. The owner, a quiet man in his 60s who had never once introduced himself, had begun leaving slightly overripe produce near the entrance on the mornings she came. Not offered. Not announced. Simply placed where she would see it. She never mentioned it to him. He never mentioned it to her. Some kindnesses work best when neither party acknowledges them directly. The afternoons she worked. Always something to improve. A shelf from scrap timber. An old rug cut to fit the floor. A curtain from cloth bought for 50 cents at a church sale. Insulation and privacy simultaneously. Small things. Slow things. And every evening when the light was gone and the work was done, she thought about the name. She asked Earl on the 4th day. Casually. The way you ask things when you want a real answer. Earl went quiet. Not the quick quiet of someone who doesn't know. The slower quiet of someone deciding how much to say. He looked at the container for a long moment. Where did you see that name? He said. Dorothy told him. The toolbox. The underside of the lid. Earl nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already half expected. Come back to me on that, he said, and walked away in his unhurried way that felt, in this particular moment, like a man putting deliberate distance between himself and a conversation he wasn't ready to finish yet. Dorothy watched him go, then looked at her notebook. The name sitting there in her own handwriting beneath everything else. Margaret Elaine Voss. Patient. Waiting. Just like the tools had been. Earl came to her on a Thursday evening. She heard him before she saw him, the particular unhurried sound of his boots on the gravel path that she had come to recognize over the weeks, the way you come to recognize the specific sounds of a place you are learning to call home. He knocked on the container door with 2 knocks. That was his way. Always 2. Never more. She opened it. He was standing on the steps she had built, 3 of them now, solid and level, constructed from timber she had found and cut and fitted with the same careful attention she had given the roof and the walls and every other thing she had turned her hands to in the past weeks. Under his arm he carried a folder. Brown cardboard, slightly worn at the corners, the kind that has been handled often and stored carefully. He sat on the top step. She sat on the second. And Earl told her about Margaret Elaine Voss. He spoke slowly, in the manner of a man who has always understood that certain things deserve to be said at the right pace, that rushing important information is a form of disrespect both to the information and to the person receiving it. Dorothy listened without interrupting because she had learned over 79 years that the most important conversations are the ones you receive rather than participate in. Margaret Elaine Voss had owned this yard. Had owned it for 31 years before Earl purchased it from her estate. 11 years ago, the paperwork handled by a solicitor in the next town, the transaction straightforward in every legal sense. Had used the yard, every part of it, the containers, the barn, the tools, the materials stacked along the walls, as her workshop for 3 decades. She had been a sculptor. Self-taught. Self-directed. Entirely outside any institutional framework or commercial system, not because she lacked ability but because she had never been interested in those systems and they had never found her, and at some point the 2 absences had simply become a life. Earl opened the folder. Showed her photographs. Dorothy took them in her hands carefully and looked at them in the evening light. The container door opened behind her, the yard quiet around them, the first stars just becoming visible above Earl's barn roof. The sculptures were extraordinary. Not in the way that requires explanation or context or the vocabulary of galleries and critics. Extraordinary in the immediate way, the way you know something is true before you know why. Made from salvaged metal. The same corrugated sheeting she had used to patch her roof. The same rusted industrial materials that filled Earl's yard and that she had been picking through daily for weeks. But in Margaret's hands, those materials had become something entirely other. Figures. Human forms caught in moments of specific emotional weight, not dramatic poses, nothing theatrical. Small quiet moments. A figure with its head slightly forward in thought. Another with one hand raised not in greeting but in the middle of saying something important. An older woman seated with her hands in her lap in the specific posture of someone who has arrived somewhere after a long journey and is simply, finally, still. Dorothy looked at that last one for a long time. Then Earl showed her the letter. Written by Margaret's solicitor after her death. Standard legal language through most of it, the dry careful vocabulary of estates and transfers and formal instructions. But at the end, 3 paragraphs that Margaret had apparently dictated personally and insisted be included verbatim. Dorothy read them slowly. Then again. Margaret had written that the tools were to remain in the container. Were not to be sold or removed or dispersed. Were to be left. Her exact word, left, as though placing something for someone specific, for whoever arrived at that container in genuine need. Not curiosity. Not convenience. Need. The real kind. The kind that has no alternatives attached to it. She had written that she believed such a person would come. Had written it with the plain certainty of someone stating a fact rather than expressing a hope. And then the part that made Dorothy set the letter down on her knee and look out across the yard for a long moment before she could continue reading. Margaret had written that she hoped whoever found the tools would discover in them what she had discovered herself at a difficult point in her own life. Not just implements. Not just practical objects for practical purposes. Permission. Permission to use what was available. To make something from the material in front of you rather than grieving the material you had lost. To put your hands on the problem and work it rather than waiting for better circumstances that might never arrive. Dorothy sat on the step with the letter in her lap, and the photographs beside her, and the yard going dark around her, and Earl sitting quietly one step below in the way he had of being present without imposing on a moment that belonged to someone else. She looked at her own hands. Age. Slightly arthritic. The hands of a woman who had spent 26 years as a seamstress and 11 years as a widow and 79 years in total making things work with whatever was available. She looked at the photographs of Margaret's sculptures. Then she looked at the corrugated metal sheeting stacked along the barn wall. At the tools in the box inside the container behind her. At the yard full of salvaged material that a woman she had never met had spent 30 years turning into something extraordinary. And something moved in her chest. Quietly. Without drama. The specific shift of something that has been waiting a long time for the right conditions. She started the first piece 4 days later. Not with a plan. Not with a sketch or a design or any of the deliberate preparation that a sensible person might apply before attempting something they have never done before. Dorothy had spent 79 years being sensible, and it had served her well in most respects and had not, in the end, prevented her from standing on a pavement with $3 and one bag. So she set sensible aside for the morning and simply picked up a piece of curved metal sheeting from the stack along the barn wall and held it in both hands and waited to see what she thought. What she thought was, "This wants to be something." She carried it to the space beside the container she had cleared and leveled over the previous week, not knowing why she was clearing it exactly, just knowing that clear flat ground felt like preparation for something. She set the metal down, looked at it, picked up the hammer from Margaret's toolbox and held it the way she had learned to hold a needle 30 years ago, not gripping, resting, letting the weight of the tool do the work rather than forcing it. She worked for most of that first day. By evening she had the beginning of a shape. Not identifiable yet, not to anyone else, possibly not even to her. But a shape with intention in it. A curve that went somewhere. A line that meant something. The difference between metal hit randomly and metal worked with a specific destination in mind. However unclear that destination remained. She stepped back and looked at it in the fading light. Then she went inside and made tea and didn't think about it for the rest of the evening because she had learned from 26 years of needlework that the best thing you can do with a piece of work at the end of a day is leave it alone and come back to it fresh. She came back to it fresh the next morning. And the morning after that. Earl watched without commenting. This was, Dorothy had come to understand, his highest form of respect, the absence of commentary from a man who was perfectly capable of it. He brought tea to the step at intervals, and occasionally stood at a distance looking at what she was doing with the expression of someone who is seeing something develop and is content to let it develop without interference. On the 6th day she finished it. Stepped back. Looked at it properly for the first time as a complete thing rather than a work in progress. A figure. Seated. Hands in its lap. Head at the specific angle of someone who has arrived somewhere after a long journey and is simply, finally, still. She had not planned to make that. Had not looked at Margaret's photograph of the similar piece and decided to reproduce it. It had simply emerged from the material and her hands and the particular accumulation of everything the past weeks had been, as though the figure had always been inside the metal and she had simply found the right way to show it. Earl came and stood beside her. They looked at it together for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Margaret would have recognized that." Dorothy looked at the figure on the ground before her. At the salvaged metal that had come from this yard. At the tools from the box that had been left in the dark for someone who would need them. At her own hands, aged and slightly arthritic and still precise, still capable, still entirely themselves. She thought about permission. About a woman she had never met who had understood something and written it into a legal document so it would survive her. About what it means to leave something useful behind for someone you will never know. About the specific extraordinary faith of that act, believing, with enough conviction to make it official, that a person would come who needed exactly what you had to leave. The word spread the way things spread in small places. Not announced. Not advertised. Simply known. The way Earl's yard was known, the way Dorothy was becoming known, through the accumulation of small observations made by people going about their ordinary days and noticing something at the edge of them that was not ordinary at all. People began coming on Saturday mornings. A few at first. Standing along the fence looking at the pieces Dorothy had set out, 3 by then, 4 by the following week. Looking with the particular quality of attention that people give things that make them stop without knowing why they stopped. A woman stood in front of the seated figure for nearly 10 minutes without moving. Then she turned to Dorothy and asked what she wanted for it. Dorothy named a number that came from somewhere she didn't examine. The woman paid it immediately without negotiating. Counted the notes into Dorothy's aged, careful hands with a straightforward transaction of someone who knows what something is worth and is not interested in paying less. Dorothy held the money for a moment. Looked at it. Then folded it carefully into her coat pocket and went back inside to begin the next piece. Because that was what you did. You finished one thing and you began the next. That was all it had ever been. Her nephew arrived on a Saturday morning. Dorothy saw his car from inside the container. She was sitting at the small table she had built along the left wall. A proper table now, level and solid, with 2 mismatched chairs she had found in Earl's barn and repaired over an evening, drinking her morning coffee and looking over the notes she had made for the 6th piece. Sketches, mostly. Rough lines on notebook paper that would mean nothing to anyone else but that she could read as clearly as a pattern. She heard the car before she saw it. Recognized the engine immediately, the specific sound of it, familiar from years of Sunday visits and school pickups and the ordinary texture of a family life that had ended, for practical purposes, on a gray morning on Carpenter Lane with a bag packed in 40 minutes and a door closed behind her. She set her coffee down. Looked through the container's small side window at the street beyond Earl's fence. His car was parked across the road. He sat in it for several minutes without getting out. She counted without meaning to, the habit of precision running automatically beneath everything she did. 6 minutes. Sitting in a parked car for 6 minutes before approaching someone tells you most of what you need to know about the state of mind you are walking toward them with. He was not certain. She had never, in 79 years, seen her nephew uncertain. She finished her coffee. Then she opened the container door and walked down her 3 steps into the yard and stood at the fence and waited for him to come to her. Because she was done walking toward things that should walk toward her. He came through the gate slowly. Stopped a few feet inside and looked at the yard the way you look at something that has not matched your expectation, taking it in section by section, reassessing. The container with its proper steps and its curtained doorway. The cleared working space beside it where 3 finished pieces stood. The materials organized along the barn wall. The small patch of earth beside the steps where she had planted things in salvaged pots that were coming up now, green and unhurried, entirely unbothered by anyone's opinion of their location. He looked at the sculptures. She watched him look. He was not a man with any particular feeling for art. She knew that about him, had always known it, the way you know things about people you have watched closely for decades. But he was a man capable of recognizing that something had happened here that he had not anticipated. That the woman he had packed a bag for and pointed at the door was not the woman standing at this fence. He looked at her finally. "I heard you were here," he said. "I live here," Dorothy said. The same 2 words she had said to him through the gate on the first evening. But different now, not defensive, not asserted against his doubt. Simply true. The statement of a fact so established it required no particular emphasis. He looked at the seated figure, the first one, the one she had kept specifically. Standing near the barn wall where the morning light hit it well. "You made that," he said. "Not a question." "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Working through something internally in the way of a man who has come with a prepared approach and is finding that the terrain has changed enough to make it irrelevant. He said there was a room. In his house. That had been sitting empty. That she was welcome to, his word, welcome, offered in the tone of someone presenting a solution to a problem they created and would prefer to stop being reminded of. Dorothy looked at him across the yard. She thought about Margaret Elaine Voss. About tools left in the dark for someone who had not yet arrived. About a woman who had understood something fundamental about what people need when everything has been taken. Not rescue, not charity, not a room in someone else's house on someone else's terms. Permission. The permission to use what is in front of you. To build rather than wait. To become, from available materials, the thing you were always capable of being. She looked at her container. At the steps she had built, and the curtain she had hung, and the sculptures she had made from salvaged metal with tools left by a stranger, and the quiet determined hands of a 79-year-old woman who had decided not to be finished. She looked at the small green things growing in their salvaged pots beside the steps. Growing without permission from anyone. Growing because that is what living things do when you give them the slightest encouragement. "I have a home," Dorothy said. Quietly. Without drama. Without the performance of strength that would have suggested she was still convincing herself. Just a fact. Her nephew looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the seated figure again. At the yard. At the container with its curtained door and its solid steps. And something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, not the clean resolution of a man who has understood what he did and why it was wrong. Something earlier than that. Something that might, with time and effort on his part, become understanding. He nodded once. Slow and small. The nod of a man who has nothing left to say that the situation hasn't already answered for him. He walked back to his car. Dorothy watched him go. Then she turned back to the yard. To the morning light on the sculptures. To the notes on the table inside waiting for the sixth piece. To the small green things growing beside her steps in their salvaged containers, asking nothing of anyone, simply doing what they had always been going to do. She went back inside, made a second cup of coffee, and sat down at her table and picked up her pencil. By the following spring, Dorothy's yard had a name. Nobody had given it one officially. No sign had been made or agreed upon or voted on by anyone. It had simply become what places become in small towns when enough people have been there and needed a way to refer to it in conversation, a name that arrived organically, without announcement, the way the best names do. Dorothy's yard. She was still living in the container. Entirely by choice. She had been offered other arrangements over the winter. Her nephew once more, a neighbor on Carpenter Lane who had heard what had happened and felt badly about not having said something at the time, a woman from the church 2 streets over who had a spare room and a good heart and meant every word of the offer. Dorothy had thanked each of them with genuine warmth and declined with equal genuineness. Because the container was hers. Not in the legal sense only, though it was that too, Earl having arranged the paperwork in November with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything. Hers in the deeper sense. The sense that comes not from being given something but from having made something. From having patched its roof with your own hands, and lined its walls, and built its steps, and cleared the ground beside it, and planted things in salvaged pots that came up green in the spring without being asked. You cannot own something that way by moving into a spare room. She had made 19 sculptures. 9 had sold. The money in her account at the bank on the main street had grown from nothing to something real, not wealth, not comfort in any excessive sense, but sufficiency. Enough. The specific dignified adequacy of a woman who has built her own floor and knows exactly how solid it is because she laid every board herself. She kept 10 pieces, including the first one. Always the first one, the seated figure with the slightly imperfect proportions and the join that a more experienced hand would have hidden. She kept it because she believed in keeping the evidence of beginnings. Because the distance between that first piece and the 19th was the most important distance she had ever traveled, and she intended to keep both ends of it visible. A small gallery 2 towns over had written to her in February. A proper letter. Formal and respectful. Asking if she would consider showing 6 pieces in their spring exhibition, a group show, other sculptors, a proper opening with proper attendance. She had written back and said yes. Earl had driven her to the opening in his truck. sat in the back row of chairs during the brief speeches and looked at his boots and occasionally at the pieces of Dorothy's that were hung and lit and labeled with small cards that said her name and her age and the materials used. Salvaged metal. Found tools. The cards didn't say the rest of it. Didn't say $3 or 43 years or a wooden box with a name inside the lid. Didn't say Margaret Elaine Voss or permission or the specific faith of a woman who had left tools in a container for someone she would never meet. But Dorothy knew. She stood in that gallery on a Thursday evening in March, 79 years old, white hair neatly kept, wire-rimmed glasses, the aged precise hands of a seamstress and now a sculptor resting at her sides, and she knew all of it. Carried it with her the way you carry the things that have made you into whoever you are standing in any given room. She thought about a pavement. $3. A sign she had almost not crossed the road to read. She thought about what would have happened if she had turned the other way. Then she stopped thinking about it because it was not a useful thought, and Dorothy had always been a practical woman. She looked at her work on the gallery wall instead. At what had been made from what was available. At what was possible when you stopped waiting for better circumstances and put your hands on the material in front of you. Her mother had told her something once, long ago, that she had filed away and not thought about in decades, and that had come back to her on the first morning in the container when she had opened a wooden box and found tools left by a stranger. "You don't need much," her mother had said. "You just need enough to begin." $3 had been enough. It had always been enough.